behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to this evening's session. Our subject tonight, as you know, is the United States and international organizations in world affairs. Our guest this evening is William C. Wood, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Inevitably, given the responsibilities and time schedule of our guests, we will have a situation where the scheduled speaker finds it impossible to be with us. And that happens at the last minute occasionally. It happened Tuesday evening. But rather than postpone or cancel the meeting, of course, we are absolutely delighted to be able to tell you that William C. Wood, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, is with us this evening, and we thank him very much for joining us. You won't be disappointed, I assure you. Now, one word in the title, that is the reference, a couple of words, the reference to sanctions is not in the general title, but Mr. Wood certainly will refer to the question of sanctions during the course of his remarks, and during the Q&A you can extend that discussion to whatever length you would like. Before introducing or presenting Mr. Wood, let me remind you, or let me thank rather, the Northrop Grumman Electronic System and Sensors for this evening's reception. And the cable rebroadcast of the evening's program is courtesy of individual members of the Council. And we thank all of you who make contributions to that particular cause, because those contributions are absolutely essential to make sure that we do these cable rebroadcasts, which we think are a wonderful way of reaching the general public. And those who contribute in increments of $250, of course, are always recognized on the broadcast itself. Our next speaker is on February 21st, Dr. Ernest Lefevre. He'll be speaking on nuclear weapons, a path to peace, ? And on March the 5th, Ambassador Edward Masters, presently President of the Indonesia American Society of the United States and a former ambassador to Indonesia, will speak on Indonesia, Asia's promise, or a continuing problem. Mr. Wood has been with the State Department as a Foreign Service officer for 20 years. He was appointed in his present position in January of 1999. He has served overseas in several Latin American countries, El Salvador, Argentina, and he has been in Italy as well. He's been was a member of the negotiating team at the Helsinki Summit in 1992. He served as lead negotiator for the United States at the NATO High-Level Task Force on Conventional Weapons. His positions in Washington have been several. He's worked on the desks, both functional and geographic. He's worked in the Office of the Civil or Political Military Affairs. He's been an assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and was on the policy planning staff for Latin America. He's received numerous awards at the State Department. I'll mention only one, and that is the James C. Clement Award for Excellence, which he received in 1998 for the work that he did as America's chief negotiator on all issues before the United Nations Security Council. And thinking in terms of the most interesting, deepening experience of that particular role is the perfect reminder to you of the appropriateness of his addressing the question of the United States and the United Nations in world affairs. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you William B. Wood.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for inviting my boss, David Welch, and for accepting me in his place. And I'd like to thank Frank Burd for that very kind introduction. International organizations is what I do. I've got this long bureaucratic title, but what it means is UN stuff. And I see by looking at this audience that I think that there are probably lots of people here who remember the early days of the UN, maybe even remember a world before there was a UN. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about maybe the difference between the world with the UN and the world without a UN as we get into this. I'd like this to be a conversation rather than a presentation, so I will try to keep my remarks brief and leave lots of time for questions. There are always more questions in the world than answers, and I certainly don't claim to be able to come up with a one-to-one correspondence, but I'll do my best with whatever question you have. The United States, U.S. foreign policy, and international organizations. Why do we bother? What's our goal? Well, it's a very easy question. We are in international organizations and we participate in them to advance our national interests. No diplomat of any nation, and certainly no diplomat of the United States, is paid to do good for others at the expense of the United States. We're in it for us. And the UN and other international organizations, of which we're a member, the OECD and others, are a good tool for foreign policy. Now that sounds slightly hard-edged, but you have to remember who us is. We're us. And part of being an American and part of formulating and carrying out American foreign policy is advancing American values, which we construe to be interests. And that means that as we are pursuing our national interests and advancing our values, we are pursuing democracy and development and human rights and free trade and, above all, peace. So pursuing national interests, when I say we're pursuing national interests, I'm speaking in the broadest possible sense of all of the interests and all of the values that we as a nation embrace. There is also, however, a strategic dimension to this. The United States, in the year 2001, and for some time now, has been the big guy. And throughout history, the big guy has always had to worry about how to preserve his place as big guy, as well as carry out his responsibilities as big guy. In essence, history seems to tell us that there are two things that can threaten our position as big guy. One of them is conflict. We have been involved in wars that were not necessarily our own a number of times this century. That would seem to argue that it might be wise for us to be proactive in attempting to limit, contain, resolve local conflicts before they reach a scale where they can threaten us. Second, we're also the big guy economically. And we have found the formula, or believe we have found the formula, for economic prosperity, and that involves the energy and ambition and drive and creativity and just plain hard work of a population that is set free to carry out all of those aspects of the human personality. And so, just as we find ourselves protecting our security interests by reaching out to the world to attempt to contain conflict, we also find ourselves attempting to both ensure our own prosperity and spread the wealth by advocating free trade and free markets and good dynamics and all of the characteristics of society that will produce those two phenomena, like democracy, rule of law, so on and so forth. So there is a real hard-nosed correlation between our national interests and our national values and the way we carry them out, and frankly, the way we carry them out, in this particular case, in international organizations. What do international organizations do? How does it work? The first and sort of lowest order of international organization activity is simple international coordination. There is a reason why all international pilots speak English. That's because the International Civil Aviation Organization years and years ago decided that there had to be one language that a pilot could speak to a tower anywhere in the world to get the plane from up in the air to down on the ground safely. English is the language. Worked out pretty well for us, actually. There is a reason that there is coordinated allocation of satellite radio frequencies. This is renewed every so often. It's called the International Telecommunications Union. That's where that happens. There's a reason why there is a more or less coherent system of maritime safety regulations. That's the International Maritime Organization. There is a reason why CDs, including, unfortunately, some modern music, is considered intellectual property and is protected. That's called the World Intellectual Property Organization. There's a reason why the international mail gets delivered. And that's called the Universal Postal Union, which, by the way, predates the UN and predates the League of Nations and goes back to the late 1800s, because every nation wants to get its mail delivered and wants to receive the mail that's being sent to it. I was talking to Dan Berger at the Baltimore Sun, and I used this example. Even in something as pedestrian as postal issues, the U.S. is playing a fairly dynamic role. Right now, we are working very hard to change the balance within the Universal Postal Union between private deliverers and national deliverers, because we have FedEx and we have UPS, and we have this whole new sector of more efficient, more active, more economically smart mail delivery, and we want to spread that around the world. At the same time, we want to protect national postal services so that the private deliverers don't simply skim the cream, pick the cherries, and leave national postal services delivering one letter at a time to some rural hamlet in Montana. There's no money in it. That's the kind of thing we do at the coordination level of international organizations. Second, there's common projects. And the biggest one probably is the care of refugees. There is an international body, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. They help 25 million people a year who have been displaced by natural disaster or been displaced by conflict, and who are in an alien country and without hope, without shelter, without the most elementary sanitary or other personal requirements. Development. There is a vast gap between the rich and the poor, and rich and poor countries in the world. The poorest in the United States are richer than the middle class in monetary terms in most countries. There are a number of international development organizations. The UN Development Program is one. Health. The World Health Organization helped eradicate smallpox. Smallpox does not exist. You may remember a debate a few years ago as to whether or not a smallpox bacillus that was hidden away in a laboratory, which is believed to be the last such example of smallpox anywhere in the world, should be destroyed or should be retained for scientific research in the future? Well, the reason that debate could exist, in large part, is the World Health Organization. Right now, it's working on AIDS, and it's working on the Ebola virus, and also working on polio. Polio brings me to another area of common international work. Children. We've all seen UNICEF Christmas cards. Yes, there really is a UNICEF behind it. It is run by an American, Carol Bellamy, and it's one of the most effective, creative, dynamic international organizations in the world. I might note that although it doesn't get the headlines, the United States contributes a little bit over $3 billion a year to the UN system, of which 54%, $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion a year, go to humanitarian, human rights, health, development, and environmental issues. So that's a large part of what we do in international organizations, and it represents the majority of what we spend in resources. Common values is the third function for international organizations. It's just possible some in this room remember Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the first chairman of the Commission of Human Rights and the head of the group that wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that is not binding, doesn't have any legal status, yet it has influenced more national constitutions, the thinking of more nations, thinking of more private groups, and possibly any such document on that subject in the history of the world, short of the Sermon on the Mount. Overwhelmingly, the values that are being developed by the international community, whether it's at the Beijing Women's Conference or the Annual Commission on Human Rights or the meeting in Copenhagen a couple of months ago on the environment, are Western values. They highlight the value of the individual. They stress the rights of the individual, his right to freedom, his right to prosperity, his right to opportunity. And in advancing Western values, these institutions advance American values. Now, to be sure, there's lots of controversy. At the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva in March, we will be criticized for the death penalty because many European countries don't believe it's a good thing. We will fight back because whatever the debate about human rights, about capital punishment is in the United States, only a small segment of the American society believes that it's a violation of human rights. And we will get criticized. And this is the dynamic nature of the international community. It provides a forum in which other views can be heard. This is sometimes troubling to us. It also provides a forum where our views can be heard. So it's sometimes troubling to them. It's a fair fight. Lastly, and I really am going to make this quick, the thing that sets the UN apart from all other international organizations is the authority of the Security Council, the primary responsibility of the Security Council for maintenance of international peace and security. Tom Brokaw's book, The Great Generation, talks about that generation that went to war and then built a brilliant America. The generation that saw the Marshall Plan, that saw NATO, that saw the National Security Act, which created our current national security institutions. And before any of that was done, indeed before World War II was over, the victors created the United Nations to, in the words of the Charter, lift from mankind the scourge of war. The Security Council is currently 15 countries. The United States is a permanent member. We have the veto along with Russia, China, France, Great Britain. I've been there. It's fascinating. Every country sends its best diplomat. They can decide things. They can decide to impose economic sanctions, which I will talk about in a moment. They can decide to send peacekeepers to monitor a peace. They can decide to authorize nation states to send soldiers to carry out a combat mission. This is what happened in Haiti. This is what happened when the Australians went into East Timor. This is what happened, pardon me, when the Italians led a force into Albania about 3 years ago. We find that's the most effective way for the international community to authorize use of force. For the U.S., UN peacekeeping is a highly controversial subject. We don't believe it's as efficient as, say, NATO, or as efficient as if we were doing it ourselves. However, we don't necessarily want to do it ourselves. Right now, 1 out of every 840 UN peacekeepers, and there are about 42,000 deployed at the moment, 1 out of every 840 is an American, which means 839 out of 840 are not Americans. Interestingly, the UN has begun to deploy civilian police, and this is in response to the fact that most of the conflicts in the world today are not like the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, but are like the war in Sierra Leone and the war in Angola and the wars in the Balkans, and largely at this point internal. And therefore, the most important contribution that the international community can make is to provide professional, impartial, highly trained, highly experienced internal security forces. That's police. And 1 out of 8 of those in the world are Americans. And they're hard to come by. There are no cadres of police standing around waiting to serve somewhere else. The military, and with apologies to Frank, the military spends all of its time, we hope, preparing to take action. In the civilian world, that's referred to as unemployment. And police are the same way. If you're not an active duty policeman, you're not a policeman. If you're not in action as a policeman, you're not a policeman. Right now there are 15 peacekeeping operations authorized by the UN. Some of these 15 and some past ones that I'll mention have been successes. UNIFIL in South Lebanon just oversaw the withdrawal of Israel from South Lebanon, ending a decades-long problem. And we expect to be drawing down the UNIFIL to just a monitoring mission very soon. Some years ago, UNIMOS in Mozambique was responsible for ending a generations-long war in that country. UNTES in the little sliver of the Balkans called Eastern Slavonia. The UN ran that little sliver for 2 years. An American, Jacques Klein, was called the transitional administrator. What he was the absolute monarch. And that is now a secure and safe area. UNMOT in Tajikistan, total of 25 peacekeepers. The rebels and the government found those 25 people indispensable. They've now been withdrawn following negotiation of a successful peace, carrying out of successful elections, and a fair division of power between the two sides. East Timor has been in the news much. East Timor represents a demonstration of the kind of sine wave that a resolution of a conflict can go through. In January of 1999, in January of a year, and I'm not going to be able to remember which because I have trouble remembering numbers, President Habibie of Indonesia said that he would be willing to consider independence for East Timor, a problem that had been lingering on the international scene since the early 70s. The international community, in particular the UN, took him at his word. By May of that year, they'd hammered out an agreement for a process which led to a referendum, which the UN was to conduct. The UN conducted it. It wasn't easy. For instance, the question on the ballot was, are you in favor of autonomy for East Timor? If you voted yes, you were voting against independence and in favor of continued association with Indonesia as under some sort of regional autonomy relationship. So the UN had a huge, not simply organizational requirement, but also an educational requirement so that the voter knew what he was voting for when he checked the box. Following that extremely successful referendum, pro-Indonesia or anti-independence militias ravaged East Timor. And we had the specter of the UN humanitarian workers refusing the instructions of their headquarters to leave because they were afraid that if they departed, the East Timorese who were seeking shelter in their compounds would be massacred. We then had the creation of something called Interfet. Sorry about all these acronyms, but that's the way us bureaucrats talk. Interfet was a new and different international presence, an Australian-led, Australian-commanded force which went into East Timor and restored order. Following that, Interfet ended, and a new blue-hatted multinational force under UN command, and that's the difference between the color of the hats. If you're green-hatted, you're responding to a national command structure. If you're blue-hatted, you're responding to a UN command structure. Went in and is now keeping peace in the region while UN civilian workers run the region preparatory to local elections and the formation of a national government, at which point the UN will tip its hat and say, you're a country, goodbye. Those have been some of the successes. We've got some failures too. UNIVIM in Angola, which is one of our largest peacekeeping operations, in there for a long time, finally had to depart when the government asked it to, following a breakdown of the peace process between the government and the UNITA rebels. There were relatively few casualties there. The most prominent was the death of the principal UN negotiator who died in a plane crash in the service of peace. UNISOM in Somalia. I think we all remember the terrible scenes there. UNPROFOR in Bosnia, one of the UN's largest peacekeeping operations and one of its least conclusive. Let me stop with UNISOM and UNPROFOR for just a moment because they're very important in the history of our recently troubled relationship with the UN. Following the Second World War, when the offsetting vetoes of the U.S. and following the Cold War, when the offsetting vetoes of the U.S. and the Soviet Union were no longer a problem, there was an enormous exhilaration, enthusiasm, optimism about the international scene. Now, without the East-West dynamic, countries of goodwill could cooperate to tamp down these local conflicts, which people had always suspected were made worse by the East-West dynamic. Well, in fact, what we discovered was that these local conflicts remained just as intractable, just as unmanageable as they always had been, and indeed it is possible that while we had always been afraid that we, the superpowers, had been instrumentalizing the little guys to advance our own interests, it turned out that they were at the very least equally instrumentalizing us to advance their parochial goals. But during this period of optimism, deployment of UN peacekeepers reached a historic high point of about 74,000 in 1994. And with the disenchantment about peacekeeping in Somalia and dissatisfaction with the results in Bosnia. That 74,000 dwindled, in large part because of U.S. insistence, down to 12,000 in early 1999. Just a few, at that time, peacekeeping missions, the Golan Heights, Lebanon, Tajikistan, and a few others. Now we're back on the rise. As I indicated earlier, there are more than 40,000 UN peacekeepers deployed. We think we're doing it better, we think we're doing it smarter, but it's hard. But deploying peacekeeping missions is not the only thing that the Security Council and the UN can do. They can also impose sanctions. The UN Charter specifically cites economic sanctions as an alternative to the use of military force by the international community in order to, quote, give effect to the Council, to the decisions of the Security Council. What does that mean? It means that the Security Council places a demand on a country, and it's entitled to impose sanctions on that country until it fulfills that demand. The two most prominent cases, although there are many others, are Iraq and Libya. In the latter case, we have just had an important success because a trial that would never have taken place if multilateral sanctions had not been imposed through the Security Council has found a Libyan intelligence operative acting unquestionably for his government, guilty of the Pan Am 103 bombing. On Iraq, the success is equally great. For a period of 10 years, in spite of his best efforts, in spite of its best efforts, the regime in Baghdad has been unable to regain control of the enormous economic resources that Iraq possesses, nor to recapture the enormous political influence that a government representing a country with the historical and cultural heritage that Iraq possesses. There are lots of problems in the diplomacy of Iraq. It is sort of a nested sequence of international programs. There is the arms control effort, the non-proliferation effort, inspectors and other techniques for ensuring that Iraq does not regain the power to threaten its own population, its immediate neighbors, or the region. The sanctions regime, which is put in place in service of that goal to, on the one hand, motivate Iraq to cooperate with the arms control element, something it's not doing, or failing that, to prevent it from having the resources it needs to rearm. It is doing that. And third, and this is another demonstration of the way policies evolve over time. The unprecedented oil for food program, the single largest humanitarian program on earth, which takes Iraq's oil revenue, carves off roughly a third of it for payment of compensation to those directly injured by Iraqi aggression, and takes the other 2/3 and controls its use so that it cannot be used to purchase anything but food, medicine, and infrastructure improvements. It's a regime that's under some pressure at the moment, but it's working. And from the U.S. strategic point of view, the core requirement that Iraq not rearm, not represent a military threat to the region, is completely intact, we believe. Sanctions have collateral damage. It's a clumsy instrument. Every day we're getting smarter about how we write sanctions, what kind of exceptions we put in as a matter of course, how we administer them. It's still a clumsy instrument, but it's a lot less clumsy than military action. It represents many fewer threats to the United States than multilateral military action, in part because, if I can recall my previous boss, Madeleine Albright, with whom I worked in New York as well as in Washington, we are the indispensable nation. And if we want the international community to be effective, we're going to have to be involved. It's much better for us to be involved in sanctions enforcement than in military operations, if indeed we can achieve the same goal. Finally, resources. We think that just yesterday we had a breakthrough. Yesterday the Senate voted to authorize disbursement of $582 million in payment toward our back dues to the UN. We are, we're still waiting for House action. The new administration has joined with the old administration to support resolving this issue as quickly as possible. There are other elements, other requirements to bring us up to speed, up to date on our payments for the UN. We're projecting a peacekeeping bill this year of about $845 million. That's a lot of money. Our regular budget dues that go to all of the other things that I was talking about come in at about $300 million a year. And the rest of it, as I indicated earlier, is voluntary contributions to humanitarian, human rights, developmental, environment, so on and so forth. There's a big investment in the United Nations for all of us. Generations of Americans so far have found it a good investment. Certainly, we have always been willing to substitute American money for American lives, and that's one of the things that we do by supporting UN peacekeeping. Certainly, we have always been willing to not simply have values, but spread values, and that's one of the things we do through the UN human rights and social bodies. And certainly, we've always believed that it's better to have a cooperative neighborhood than a neighborhood of rich and poor, sad and happy, uneducated and educated, alone, thinking their own thoughts, staying behind their own gates until they decide to break out. That's what the UN does for a living, and I hope you support it. Why don't I stop there?
Well, for an extraordinarily lucid overview, this historically experienced audience thanks you very much. The floor is now open for questions. Would you comment on the Secretary General's report on Rwanda and its implications, on the massacres in Rwanda?
It's a painful question. The United States has already publicly indicated that we are not satisfied with the role we played in that event. In April 1994, a genocide began in Rwanda in which the Hutu minority killed perhaps 1 million of the Tutsi, or Watusi if you remember the King Solomon Mine movie, minority, the formerly ruling minority. They did it at a time of national fear, because formerly exiled Tutsis were returning to the country in an armed way and looked like they were likely to take over. That's by way of historical explanation. That's not by way of justification for the massive killing of Tutsis in any way. This occurred at the high point of American dissatisfaction with UN peacekeeping in Bosnia and Somalia. And one of the findings of the UN report was that in American decision-making, that dissatisfaction with UN peacekeeping and the lack of American support for UN peacekeeping is one of the factors that caused us to not support a more active UN military role to put an end to those massacres. I'm familiar with the report because although I was not part of the decision-making process at that time, I was in charge of providing the writers of that report with their information on the U.S. perspective. There are lots of arguments as to whether or not a small or even a medium-sized 15,000 man body of international troops could have quickly put an end to the massacres at an acceptable cost to them. It's a question that we do not know the answer to and will never know the answer to. It is part of the nature of foreign policy. It is part of the nature of policy making in general, that you are forced to make decisions with imperfect information. It's not a technocratic, it's not a technical matter. You can't just add it up. Myself, one of my jobs at the moment is making determinations as to whether or not we will or will not support peacekeeping operations. I think I probably would not support it now, have supported going in that case. And the reason is you had a society in conflict with itself. There was no safe ground. In evaluating what to do, I have to think of Americans. Would I send Americans into that environment? There were no volunteers. The troops that were there, who were Belgian at the time, had been under threat and wanted out. And the question was, do we allow them to come out? Do we support their coming out? Or do we send in reinforcements? I think we should have done better. I am not sure how we could have done better.
Would you comment on whether the State Department is broken and ineffective?
Also aimless. Well, speaking as a part of the State Department, certainly broken, but not ineffective or aimless, I think. I think that this is an extraordinarily difficult question. Following the end of the Cold War, I think that we in the State Department, I think the United States in general, have had difficulty identifying and articulating to the American people and to the Congress why an activist U.S. foreign policy is important to America. It isn't as simple as it was during the Cold War. It isn't if you couldn't convince somebody that we needed an active policy or an offensive policy, you could certainly convince them that for defensive reasons we needed resources and manpower and so on and so forth. I think that we all agree that there is global trade and global investment is an important component. I think I've talked about values and the spreading of our values. Protecting of our citizens I mean, I know we get some bad press about this, but I can tell you I've been in embassies. When something happens to an American citizen overseas, everything stops. It becomes immediately our most important priority. But we haven't been able to explain it in a way that apparently the American people can understand it, nor have we been able to convince the United States Congress to date that that a congressman by congressman approach to foreign policy is not the best way to do it. That maybe we ought to try to kind of work together a little bit better. I think to some degree the disarray in the national consensus about foreign policy is a reflection of our own security about our national position. It is a luxury for a polity to be disorganized about a subject. And that luxury is based on a sense of security for the most part. We hope it gets better. Certainly, Secretary Powell has been an enormous morale booster. I have to say that, again, I worked very, very closely with Secretary Albright when she was Ambassador Albright in New York, and then when she was Secretary of State in Washington. She was dedicated to the State Department too. We'll have to see what happens, but foreign policy is hard, and the State Department often has to explain the problems rather than the triumphs, and that never gets you a vote.
Would you comment on the future of sanctions against Iraq?
Certainly, it's one of the more complex elements. The sanctions regime and the oil for food exception to the sanctions regime are extremely intricate. But you can step back from that and say, there is not widespread violation of the sanctions. Indeed, the sanctions, although there is the occasional pinprick, are pretty much intact, and the international consensus in favor of implementing Security Council resolutions remains pretty much intact. There are disagreements as to how you implement them. What does the future hold? Well, first, there is no sentiment in the current administration, nor is there any sentiment in the past administration, to weaken the box that contains Baghdad. Second, there is, with the current administration, as there was in the last administration, a desire to work with the other permanent members of the Security Council, the Islamic community, and others, to find an effective way to restore the consensus and the equilibrium and the best way to contain Baghdad. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there is a determination that it is Iraq that will change and not the United States. And the way we would prefer that it change is through compliance with Security Council resolutions and through a liberation of its own people from who are, in the end, the worst sufferers under Saddam Hussein's regime. The new administration is reviewing the tactical question of how to approach the issue, but the strategic question of standing firm is not under review. We all agree about that.
What intellectual leadership do you see President Bush giving to the leadership of American foreign policy?
I've been in the business now, as Frank said, about 20 years. and I was overseas when Ronald Reagan was elected, and indeed my ambassador at that time was a Democratic political appointee, and that pretty much ended him. And you know, they asked sort of that same question about Ronald Reagan. And they criticized Ronald Reagan for being an absentee manager and oversimplistic, and said many of the same things that they are saying about President Bush. And I can only say I haven't felt any shortage of guidance from the Secretary of State. I haven't seen any shortage of coordination between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. I haven't seen any failure to act or failure to be involved on the part of the President, who I gather spoke to Arafat today, who's spoken to dozens of leaders since in his 2 weeks in office, and is very active. I think that the success of any administration and the management style of any administration is difficult to predict. Certainly some of our best managers and most knowledgeable presidents, most articulate presidents, fall into a category. And some of our most effective and honored presidents may fall into that same category, and they may fall into another category. We'll have to see.
The question was the difficulty of recruiting neophytes into the Foreign Service.
It's not difficult enough. If it were, they'd have to pay us more. We receive about 10,000, 15,000 applicants a year. This is down from previous highs. We do not require, or have not required, and do not intend to require any specific academic background, any language capabilities, or anything else. The process is you take an exam, and if you're above a certain level, you get invited in for an oral interview and some exercises that are designed to test whether or not you have common sense. I leave it to you as to whether or not those tests are successful. I'm not telling you which end of the grading pattern they hire, but the fact of the matter is, this is the best job in the world. There are criticisms about, political appointees like Felix Rohatyn, and the fact is there are all of these people out there who, having gone out and worked hard and been extremely successful, the best thing they can think of to do with their success is to try to do what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Representing the United States, we lack resources. I think we could probably do with a little more respect at home. But it's a great country to represent. It's easy to represent it with pride. And it's easy to travel the world selling the American product. So I think that the one place where we have problems is attracting minorities. We now have a Secretary of State who is black. His predecessor was a woman. We're doing better.
Would you care to comment on how history will view Madeleine Albright?
Well, first let me say how I view her. And I can do that in sort of three anecdotes. The first one occurred about 2 days after I got to New York. I'd been called there on an emergency basis because we were worrying about Somalia, we were worrying about Haiti, and we were also worrying a major resolution to change the sanctions regime on Serbia. And the folks there were capable of doing 2 out of the 3, but they needed another body to do the third one. And since I was on vacation and that was not considered to be a national priority, I was the third one. So I began to meet with her, and we walked through the very intricate elements of this resolution, and as was appropriate, sort of every third line out of my mouth was, well, Madam Ambassador this, and Madam Ambassador that, and Madam Ambassador. And she had enough of that pretty quick, and she finally said, well, expletive deleted, but she finally said, Bill, my name is Madeline. And she stayed Madeline for the next 3 years. Unfortunately, when she got to be Secretary of State, she had to tolerate being called Madam Secretary of State. My second anecdote was an evening in the Security Council about 1:45 in the morning. There had been a break in the negotiations. We had another couple of hours of negotiations ahead of us. But the ambassador from Botswana and she began to talk. And I'm not sure how it transpired, but she decided that that was a good time during that break to teach the ambassador from Botswana the Macarena. And she cuts a pretty good rug. My third memory of Ambassador Albright was she was not very tall. And the Russian ambassador was extremely tall. The British ambassador was even taller. And there were 1 or 2 others who were well above 6 feet. And on a Middle East resolution, I can remember then Ambassador Albright talking to about 5 of these giants for an hour, looking almost straight up in the air, not giving an inch. She was tough. And that's my third anecdote. What were the characteristics of the foreign policy she espoused? She loved democracy. She loved the rule of law. She believed in accountability and supported international tribunals and things like that. She was an activist. Her pride in the United States was absolute and vivid. How will she be remembered? I don't know. I remember her with great admiration and great fondness.
We appreciate this evening very much. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, largely informative, and perhaps even inspiring. Thank you very much.